Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me okay in the back? Okay, y'all awake? I'm going to go ahead and switch the slide here and get us onto cultural heritage. Before I begin, I just wanted to say thank you to Earthwatch for organizing an incredible summit over the last several days. And it's been a true, exciting experience for me to be in a room with all these brilliant minds that are here, all these scientists, as well as the public who have come to hear our talks today. I am going to not be talking about water so much, so I hope that's okay. And we're going to be talking about what is so revolutionary about farming. And this is something that you may not think about very often, but there is a major transition that happens. I would say that 90% of human history is spent hunting and gathering. The last 10% of our history, we decided to switch and become farmers full time. And this is truly a very big deal, probably the single greatest event in human history, because it changes all kinds of human relationships, and it changes all kinds of relationships humans have with the environment as well. Before I get into that a little bit more, I want to show you where the study area is, where our archaeological project is located. And some of you may be familiar with the southwestern portion of the United States. And there's an area called the Four Corners, where the states of Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah come together. And we are located in the very southwestern portion of Colorado. Some of you may have been there on vacation and experienced a tour of Cliff Palace at Mesa Verde National Park. This is an ancestral Pueblo village that dates to about 1250 AD. Now, the reason why I show this to you is because farming had already been taking place in this region for about 1,600 years prior to this village being constructed. So what we need to do is go back in time and start to analyze exactly what that Neolithic revolution is before we can apply it to our project. Now, by definition, the Neolithic revolution is an economic transformation that involved the domestication of wild food resources, as well as the establishment of permanent settlements, so households on the landscape that you don't move. Now, this is so fascinating to anthropologists and archaeologists across the world because we know that there is no single revolution, that you can have sedentism and the domestication of food resources happen, but they don't have to happen in the same sequence. So for example, in the Near East, about 10 to 12,000 years ago, we have the very first crops being domesticated, but it turns out that people are actually settling down before they're domesticating their crops. The opposite example would be located in the southwestern United States, where we actually have crop domestication first and then full-time sedentism. So again, no single revolution. Now going back to the project area, our first domesticated crop was maize, or what we know today commonly as corn. And this started from a wild grass called teosinte, located in Mexico, and it made its way up from Mexico into the larger Colorado Plateau by about 2000 BC. It took a little bit longer for it to reach our project area, but it did show up in southwestern Colorado by about 400 AD. Now you may be asking, what is this big deal? So what? So we switched the way that we live on the landscape. The big deal, as I mentioned earlier, are the way that we are going to relate to each other as human beings, and also how human beings are relating to the environment, and even looking at the environment to see if it can sustain our increase in populations. Because I must say that as soon as we made this switch, human populations skyrocketed, and we are at an all-time high today. Now, when we look at the project area, we can see that people for the first time are choosing to live together in aggregated communities. So the very first villages we start to see forming in southwest Colorado happen at about 500 AD. And we know that people, again, are creating architecture that can no longer be moved because they don't have to bring it with them on their seasonal rounds to collect food. So they're making two different types of architectural constructions. One is domestic, which is your regular, everyday household structure, and the other is public architecture, which are constructions built for entire members of the community to come together and aggregate for integrative purposes. The other big thing that we see happening is food storage. And there are plenty of scientists who study the Neolithic revolution that will say that this revolution could not have taken place unless human beings figured out how to store food. We wouldn't be here sitting in this room today in such high numbers if we don't have this key thing in place. So people decide that food storage is important, and that allows them to bank food for the coming years in case they have a crop that fails. Now, the other big thing, and this is really cool to us archaeologists, is that there are changes in material culture or technology that go hand in hand with this revolution. The first one being the invention of pottery, and more specifically, cooking pottery. It's something that we all take for granted in this room when we go to heat up our meals every day. But what happened in the past before pottery was that people had textiles, or basketry, essentially, that were waterproofed, and they would heat up stones or rocks in a fire, and then take those rocks and drop them into the basketry to cook their food. Now, this is a lengthy process, and it's something that we couldn't even imagine doing today. When you have true cooking pottery, and it's been fired, you can actually take that pot with your food in it, place it directly onto a heat source, a fire or a hearth, for example, and then your food is processed much more quickly, and then you can absorb all of the nutrients completely from your food. The other major invention that is an independent invention across the world at different times is the use of a bow and arrow. And I'll talk a little bit more about this towards the end of the presentation. Now, there's all kinds of changes in social relationships that occur when people settle down to become farmers. This is the first time, archaeologically, where we start to see social hierarchy emerge. So, for example, if I'm a farmer and I have a really excellent year and have extra crops and I store them, but my neighbor, unfortunately, had locusts come in and eat all of their crop, they may come to me for help and say, by the way, can I borrow this? And I might say, yeah, with interest. So that's one possibility. It leads to social structure, meaning that I have more of an economic advantage in the community than somebody else. The other thing we start to see is craft specialization, meaning that I am now afforded the opportunity to, let's say, become a potter full-time, whereas somebody else out there in the audience may choose to be a farmer full-time. You don't have to be a potter, and I don't have to be a farmer, but what we can do is trade our resources so that we have everything we need for everyday life. So there is craft specialization, or basically developing a profession, so to speak. The other thing that happens is social networks. As hunters and gatherers, we are moving across the landscape, and we are able to obtain all the resources that we need based on where we go to collect those resources. But if we become sedentary and are no longer moving, we have to establish social networks in place in order to receive those materials. So this is something new that we see happening archaeologically as soon as people make that switch to farming. Why switch? This is such an interesting statistical slide in the sense that when anthropologists study this Neolithic revolution across the world, what we've come to realize is that if you're a hunter and gatherer, you work many less hours per week than a farmer. Your diet is actually broader and better. Your general health is extremely good. You live longer, and guess what? You're taller than if you're a farmer. So you may ask, why would human beings make this switch? What is so attractive about this? Well, and it comes down to something at the bottom here called starvation. If you're a hunter and gatherer, and let's just say we're going out to look for a berry source, we get there only to realize that a bear has gotten there before us, and therefore we go into starvation mode, but we know there's another resource located nearby, and therefore our starvation is actually short-lived. However, if we're a farmer, we are banking on a single crop that takes several months in order to harvest. And if that doesn't come through for us, and if we have nothing in storage, we will go into a starvation mode that is much longer lasting. Right? So benefits can be that starvation is more uncommon if you're a farmer, only if you have storage facilities in place that are filled. Now, I went back to that concept of craft specialization, social hierarchy. These are also additional benefits for wanting to make this switch, as well as having access to other resources, access to marriage partners, and protection. There's quite a bit of safety in numbers. So these are all the benefits of making this switch, even though we're giving up our height, our good health, and our longevity. All right, now I wanted to show you an example of the earliest cooking pottery that is found in the study area that I work within. This is a grayware jar, and as you can see, this is what people are using to take the earliest domesticated foods, which happens to be corn in our case, and cooking this over a hearth. And at the top, you're just seeing examples of decorations on this pottery that we find in our study area. Okay, so now that I've given you a background on the Neolithic revolution and why this is a really important transition to human beings, we're going to take an archaeological site in the Southwest and apply this knowledge to ask questions about the very first communities, about how they're living, what social networks they have, and how they're setting up their villages. So I am working at an archaeological site called the Dillard site, named after a landowner. And I have had the pleasure of working with 63 Earthwatch citizen scientists over the last 2 field seasons. And they are involved in not only the excavation work, but also the processing of artifacts in our laboratory and doing data entry with what we're learning. So we don't just go out to an archaeological site and start digging. That would be a faux pas. We actually have to develop a research design, like any good scientist, and go out there with a series of research questions. And in particular, these are the questions we're asking about the Dillard site. What is the time period of the village? What are the origins of the first farmers? Where did they migrate from? What is the community formation like, and did it occur slowly or quickly? What is the population of the village? How many people were living there? And also, what is the environment like? We know that we have this pristine environment that our first migrant farmers are moving into, and we want to know, what does the environment look like when they get there? And then what happens to the environment when the population starts to grow? Is there a carrying capacity on the land, and how are humans and the environment relating to one another? So what have we learned? Let's start with time period. I'm not going to go into the different types of dating techniques that archaeologists use and how they work, but you can know that in the Southwest, we rely primarily on tree ring dating, archaeomagnetic dating, accelerator mass spectrometry dating. Those are the 3 main ones. And with Earthwatch volunteers, we have collected data to give us insight into the Dillard site occupation, and have realized that we have a main occupation going from about 550 AD all the way till about 650, late 600s, somewhere in there. So archaeologically, that places us into a time period called the Basket Maker III period, and that just has a span from 500 to 750 AD. Now, who were the first farmers? Before I get into this, I should tell you that we cannot study human DNA on this project. There was a law passed in 1990 called the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act that prevents scientists from extracting DNA from Native American remains. So that being said, we have to put on our thinking caps and ask ourselves, how can we get at this question using artifacts that we're excavating from the site? Well, for us, we're lucky, because what we know is that prior to 500 AD, there are 2 very distinct culture groups living on the landscape to the east and to the west of our project area. The people on the east side actually are producing a pottery with a lead glaze. All right, that's how they do it over in the east. On the western side, they're producing pottery not with a lead glaze, but using pigments that are iron-based. So when we look at the pottery that's decorated and coming out of our project area, we can absolutely 100% say we have no pottery with lead glaze, but all of our pottery comes from the tradition of the West, where there are iron-based designs. So that tells us our first farmers are migrating from the West and a little bit to the south of the project area. Now, when we ask about community formation, those dates that I showed you earlier are going to give us a key understanding to the nature and tempo of how the village is forming over time. And it turns out our village formed within one generation, all right, so about 20 years. And what we found through a series of excavation work and also remote sensing techniques is that we have 14 households at the site, and they are divided up between a northern and southern neighborhood. And in the center of the community is our public architecture, or what we call a Great Kiva. Now, I want to show you a video here that's an animation on what the Great Kiva looks like and how it's being constructed. And what we'll find here is that this is a building that is 11.5 meters in diameter. People excavated this with digging sticks. Okay, so there's no metal during this time period. So they're digging out the soil, placing in pieces of wood for the roofing structure, putting on additional support materials for the roof. There's an entryway located at the very top where people enter into the structure via a ladder. When you go down into the structure, you can see a hearth behind the ladder and also a small ledge, or what we call a bench, inside the structure where people can sit. Now, this Great Kiva can hold the entire population of the Dillard site, plus the surrounding community, where people can get together for integrative activities, including rituals, ceremonies, political debates, so to speak, and storytelling, and so on and so forth. Now, what is the population of the village? I already mentioned that we have 14 households at the Dillard site. When we excavate households, there's no way of knowing how many people actually lived per house. But what we can do as archaeologists is go out and look ethnographically, cross-culturally, across the world, at all the different farming societies that are dry land farmers, meaning they don't use irrigation to water their crops. They're just relying on precipitation alone. Turns out that in these communities, between 5 and 7 people are living per household. So we can take that number, multiply it by the number of households that we have at the Dillard site, 14, and come up with a population estimate of between 70 and 98 people living at the site. And this is contemporaneous structures. Okay, I want to also give you a glimpse into what the village may have looked like. And I want to mention that these animations are basically funded by Crow Canyon Archaeological Center, Oregon Public Broadcasting, as well as the State Historic Fund of Colorado. And if anybody's ever seen Time Team America on PBS, our site was featured as one of the episodes of Time Team. All right, so we are cruising over the south neighborhood. Now we are getting on top of the Great Kiva and into the north side of the neighborhood, where you can see these pit houses or residential structures, a little bit of corn on the outside, as well as a stockade or a wooden fence dividing space within the village. All right, now one of the things that we have our citizen scientists work on is the processing of artifacts in the laboratory. One task that we have them do is try and figuring out the material type that our stone tools are made out of. And in particular, is it local or is it non-local? Turns out, after analyzing almost 20,000 pieces of stone tool debris from our site, that 99.7% is local, meaning they can just go out into their backyards, find a nice rock, and make a stone tool. But we have 0.3%, which is non-local. And in particular, I want you to take a good look at the dark rock in the lower right-hand corner. This is obsidian, or an igneous volcanic-like rock that is excellent for making stone tools because it maintains a very sharp edge. And what we did was source that obsidian to find out where exactly on the landscape is it coming from. This was exciting for us because it actually is coming from the Valles Caldera. This is a location in north central New Mexico where Earthwatch just happens to have another project there studying this source of human behavior and these rocks over time. So we have linked a wonderful social network of trade between Cortez, Colorado, and the Valles Caldera. We also, again, are trying to reconstruct that human relationship with the environment. So one of the things we have our volunteers do is collect sediment soil samples. We put that through a process of water agitation, so to speak. And what happens is the preserved plant remains will rise to the top. We skim those off, dry them, and then look at them under a microscope. What we have found is that there are 3 domesticates being used at the Dillard site: corn, beans, and squash. And these are the primary food resources of the modern Pueblo people today that they grow as well. Now, the residents of the Dillard site are also supplementing their diets with other plants in the environment that they're harvesting, including mustards, tobaccos, sunflowers, cattails, so on and so forth. So these are used for not only food sources, but also economic and medicinal sources as well. And then I also mentioned that bow and arrow a little bit earlier in the presentation. We are seeing people at the Dillard site basically go out and supplement their harvests with animal proteins, including cottontail rabbit, elk, deer, and wild turkey. And I have to say, one evening, we had a little extra time, and we brought out what we call a spear and atlatl, which is a hunting technology that was used prior to the invention of the bow and arrow. And I have to tell you, we had this plastic turkey that we call Tom that we were aiming at, and it was very difficult to actually get a good shot at Tom. In fact, nobody brought Tom down this evening. So we were all grateful that we had made that switch to farming, because that meant we were going to be fed that night. So in conclusion, I just wanted to say thank you to all the citizen scientists that have worked on this project over the years. This data collection can be done by anybody in this room. You do not have to be a professional scientist to get involved in these projects. And you are contributing to a major concept, including probably the single most important event in human history, which is that transition from hunting and gathering to farming. So thank you all for being here.
So we have time for a couple questions. Yes, right there. Oh my gosh, a whole lineup. Go for it.
Grab some water. Thanks.
Great. Mine's an environmental justice question. What you call artifact, we call our heritage. So when who does that go to? Does it go to the Pueblo people when you finish dating it? What is the understanding between you and the people?
Yeah, so the land that we are excavating on is private land, which means it's not in possession of any Native American group. So we have a contract with the landowner to basically remove the artifacts, process them in our laboratory, and then they go to a place called the Anasazi Heritage Center, which is a permanent government-funded curation facility, so that future researchers can pull the collections at any point and do more research.
And then
I heard that the Mexicans were the ones who modified teosinte so it became a large grain. Did that happen separately as convergent evolution at every place, or was that something that was imported from the area where it was developed?
Yeah, this is a single event. So the very first domestication was in Mexico, and then through the migration of people bringing the corn crop with them, they are the ones that imported that into the southern portion of the United States. So we did not invent that because teosinte did not grow in our study area naturally. Yeah.
there, and then you'll be
Why are the
next.
agricultural people not as healthy?
Ah, great question. We're not as healthy because we don't have as broad of a diet. If we were hunting and gathering, we would have nuts, grains, seeds, berries, animal proteins, and it would be such a diverse mix of food that we would take in at different times of the year. And now it's something like the world's population relies primarily on 8 domesticated grains, 3 of which are most dominant, including wheat, corn, and rice. So unfortunately, we're less healthy because our diet isn't as good as it used to be.
Wow. Yes, right here. Go ahead.
Hi. The video reconstruction or video portrayal that you showed showed the landscape in the background as being highly degraded or characteristic of a highly degraded landscape. And I'm wondering, was that historically accurate, or at that time were the great grasslands and the prairies still covering out to that area, or is that what it actually looked like? Was it in bad condition at that time?
Yeah, so the condition of the environment at the time is what we call pinyon and juniper forest and also sageland. And so as people moved into villages, in order to have construction wood for their buildings and also wood for everyday hearth use, they are actually denuding the landscape and taking trees down. So that representation in the video is accurate, being that there's no trees and very little vegetation within the village. That being said, you would have to travel outside the village to obtain a little bit more wood samples to bring back for, again, hearth use and for building material. But outside of the village, you would see more of a juniper and pinyon forest.
And the land fertility was sufficient for growing crops?
Yeah, land fertility is. We have what we call a aeolian sediment, meaning that these are soils that are transported by primarily wind and a little bit of water action. And believe it or not, even in the desert Southwest, they are incredibly fertile. And again, this is all dryland farming, no irrigation.
So 2 more questions. Here's one, and maybe one's over there.
I'm curious if you have any comments on modern agriculture and how, because we are, you know, from your location, you're saying they're dry land farmers, and do you have any comments on the future of modern agriculture and the lack of water?
Oh wow,
Maybe
that's
you
a big
could
question.
repeat that just so they hear it.
You know, the area I live in, Southwestern Colorado, I would say half of the county is still doing dry land farming and relying on natural precipitation. And I have lived in that portion of the country for the last 20 years, and I can say that I have experienced drought just since I've been living there. So the ability to do dry land farming is dwindling, so to speak. You know, 60% of the human population works with agriculture in some way, shape, or form. And I've mentioned already that we can't go back. We are at such a high level of population that I would guess 3/4 of the world's population would have to go away in order for the environment to sustain us. So this is a very tricky question you ask, because I have a feeling this isn't good. And we are reliant so much on agriculture today and will be for the future if we don't figure out other means to feed ourselves.
I think that's a question over a drink later.
Yeah.
One more over here. That's a hot question. Oh,
Well, you have explained that you have found out trading of objects and things like that. Have you found out some other evidence about migration people from one village to another areas or another villages?
Sure. You know, migration between villages is hard to get at, because if we look at either skeletal morphology or how people create artifacts to understand when people are moving across the landscape, sometimes it can look very similar. So even though I showed you that slide of an Eastern and Western tradition, everything pretty much looks the same with those very small details. But every once in a while, we do find archaeological evidence of people shifting on the landscape and settling in other places. And there are material culture trademarks that we can use to figure that out. So one analogy I use is that, how many of you in this room bake pie crust or bake pies and make your own crust? Okay, I guarantee you that most of you have learned from somebody in your family, and that you may have even very different recipes. I know one woman that uses vodka in her recipe because it increases elasticity. I know other people that use Crisco or just butter. So what I'm getting at is this is a learning hallmark. You've learned it from someone who's taught you, and you are now part of a larger, what we call community of practice. Archaeology is the same way. We can look at pottery, stone tools, and other types of things like basketry to figure out where you learned how to do what you do, and that allows us to trace people on the landscape. But so when we find those hallmarks, it's pretty exciting for us because we can see those movements happening over time.
I think we should give a huge applause to Susan. That was great. Woo.